has been on the show with us, but we're lucky to have him, one of the most well-respected names and minds in fantasy and in football data analysis. You caught my eye recently, I think it was last week, when you were writing up tight ends and Dalton Kincaid, and you had some back and forth on Kincaid, and you told me that you were maybe done with or doing the Bills chapter for Warren's site. Let's get an overall from you, Rich, if you would, on the Bills and their skill position players. You may or may not know. I mean, we're in here talking about them every day for many years. And as successful as they've been, especially like quintessentially last year, I at least struggle with their talent, with their setup going into this year, as I did last year. And I guess they have scoreboard because they literally set a franchise record in points. I don't know. Like, how solid are they, in your opinion, on offense? Should someone like me maybe just stop worrying about it?
Yeah, I think you should probably stop worrying about it. Well, one, because they got one position right. They've got an alpha at the position that matters the most, right? So if you got quarterback right, a lot of things fall in line. The Bills are very interesting from an offensive stance because they are kind of like a team, like if you would equate them to like baseball, like a team full of utility men. Like they love to play everyone. Like they play more guys on offense than just about every other offense in the NFL. I mean, they're playing 3 running backs with James Cook, Ray Davis, and Ty Johnson, playing now third downs last year. At wide receiver, the only wide receiver that was on the field for them on over 70% of the dropbacks last year was Mac Hollins. And that's because of, how much, he impacts the run game, and now he's not on the team anymore. Then you look at what they did this offseason in replacing him, and Amari Cooper still being on the wide open market, adding Elijah Moore and Josh Palmer, 2 guys that really haven't been, alpha targets themselves. It looks like they're going to roll this thing back where they just play a lot of receivers as well. They play multiple tight ends. They play a lot of 12 personnel. So you get Dawson Knox in on the run game and in bigger sets, Dalton Kincaid, as kind of like that flex Y guy. And so they just play a lot of guys. I mean, the linchpin of this thing, too, outside of Josh Allen, has been the offensive line, right? Like the Buffalo Bills, and I don't want to throw a hex on anyone listening here, like especially in the first couple minutes beyond the show. No one has run hotter than the Bills in terms of offensive line continuity the past 2 years. I mean, they just have not suffered injuries up front. And since the NFL's gone to 17 games, like we've seen that offensive lines don't stay intact for over 50% of the snaps. And last year, the Bills' starting offensive line was on the field for 80% of their offensive plays. That was second in the NFL. They were also second in the NFL in 2023. So they've just run ultra pure on just keeping this offensive line continuity together, which has been massively under kind of reported because, outside of Deion Dawkins and Spencer Brown, they don't have a lot of great all-pro type offensive linemen. But when you keep your starting linemen on the field, that's already an edge over the field in the NFL because there's just so many injuries and so many, rotating blocks on the offensive line across the NFL now.
So how do you think the new guys here, you mentioned Palmer and Moore specifically, we can talk about the guys that were here last year for the first year of Everybody Eats in a minute here. What sort of impact do you think or is it really very hard to gauge because you're A, players, new team, B, the Bills didn't play anyone all that much besides Mac Hollins, like you're saying, and he's not even here anymore. I don't know, what's the forecast for a guy like Palmer or a guy like Elijah Moore?
We know that one guy's locked in, right? Khalil Shakir. We know he's the slot receiver. That does limit him a little bit. You look at the past 2 years, he's only run 25 pass routes on plays that the Bills have had 1 or 2 wide receivers on the field. If the Bills are in 1 or 2 wide receiver sets, he's just not on the field, comes in and slot, cleans up on those plays that the Bills go to 3+ wide receivers. So we know that that's locked in. He probably roads block a guy like Elijah Moore, but Elijah Moore is, kind of insurance on him as well. Josh Palmer gives them kind of arguably their only man coverage beater. I mean, you look at Josh Palmer, he was 10th among qualifying wide receivers in route success rate against man coverage. So that just gives them a guy that can beat man coverage. But when you also look at him, too, he also couldn't keep Quentin Johnston off the field, played behind him. He's just never really filled the box score of his rookie contract with the Chargers, averaging under 40 yards per game. So he just screams like rotational guy. You get Curtis Samuel back, Keon Coleman. Like, these guys all scream like they're going to rotate in and out. So it's just really hard to gauge. It's a sum of parts, right? And then you factor in the running backs. They throw the running backs. And then on top of it all, the Bills don't throw a lot. Because, one, they're winning a lot of games. But you look at since they made the change to Joe Brady, their pass rate below expectation when you adjust for game script is below the league rate. They're actually minus 2%, below the base rate. So they also don't throw a lot with volume either. So they're just really tough from a fantasy standpoint.
Yeah, and that's a big change from certainly Dable 2 coordinators ago and even the guy that Brady replaced, Dorsey. Like, that changed almost on a dime when Brady took over, it seemed.
Yeah.
Rich Hribar with us. Let's talk about Dalton Kincaid within this. I'm not sure his name has even come up yet. On ADP chasing this morning, I don't know, Rich, how it sounds to you, but to me, I sort of bristled finally at why does everybody just think he's bad? Like in fantasy, it seems that everybody's decided that he's just like bad. And it was explained to me, a couple theories on this. He had the one good game in college and whatever else. But I think he might be blocked by Shakir and Knox on this team. But, man, if I were the Bills, and maybe this has already been their thinking, I'd really want to get him more involved. But whether it's injuries, and we've got knee issues here that seem maybe a little bit serious, and the what you lay out as far as other options on the team, I don't know how much hope there is for Kincaid. I'd love to see him matter more in the red zone. Big body, but with Allen's rushing prowess and then Cook last year, they really just don't need it. I don't know, Rich. Like, what kind of hope do you have for him, Kincaid, to really, jump up in stats?
Well, I think from a large part why the disappointment lies with so many gamers is the expectations were too high last year, right? Like, everyone was looking with Stephon Diggs, leaving the Buffalo Bills and looking at their wide receiver room that Kincaid was going to make this massive spike in terms of production. He was drafted really highly in context of the tight end position, expecting that breakout. I was actually a little hesitant on him because the things that you kind of hinted at is that when coming out of college, he was a very much an Evan Ingram type of player. And when you have that player for fantasy football, like, you just need a lot of pass volume. Like, he's reception based. When he was on the field last year, he actually was he led the team in targets at 31% of the team targets. Was actually second among all tight ends. Now the rub is that when he played, he only ran a route on 65% of the dropbacks because of all those things we talked about, Dawson Knox. He is kind of a glorified slot receiver. He only played 39% of the snaps at actual tight end. That was the seventh fewest amongst all tight ends. 45% were in the slot, 15% were out wide. So when you have that type of player that needs a lot of receptions, you need a lot of pass volume. And the Bills just projected to be too good last year. And I was just like, well, I'm not going to pay the iron cost on a guy that needs a lot of catches. I think it's not going to throw a lot. Now we've seen that he's kind of fallen off. He's in like that tight end, like 12 to 15-ish type range. That is a palatable place to buy in on him. The problem is the upside, right? Like, you still need this team to throw more. We talked about Dawson Knox. When Dawson Knox was in the game, the Buffalo Bills ran the ball 45% of the time, 36% for Dalton Kincaid. He ran block, not Dawson Knox, that is, almost 125 more snaps than him. So when the Bills play in these bigger sets, Kincaid's not really on the field. He's not getting to run those kind of routes that are off the play action, right? So, like, those are just all things that are kind of blocking him. And then you hitting at the red zone, like, through 2 years, Dalton Kincaid has 7 targets while standing in the end zone. Keon Coleman at 8 last year led the team in 4 missed games. Like that. So you need a lot of catches, and you're not going to score touchdowns, right? Like, so that's just not a cocktail to present a lot of upside. I think the price is fair for him this year, but where is the upside, right? And then you talk about the usage for the Buffalo Bills. It was a little bit odd last year. So his rookie year, only 11% of his targets were at or behind the line of scrimmage. Last year it doubled. It went to 22%. They're throwing him all these quick hitters in the flat. Like, you probably watched a lot of these, and you saw them all. It's just like, well, where's the balance? Where are the intermediate targets? Because oddly enough, his deep targets went up too. He had his rookie year 7.7% deep target rate. Last year It almost doubled, 14.7%. The success wasn't there. He only caught 2 of 11 deep targets last year. So a little bit more success, we can get that yardage bump because, he was below 50 yards in 10 of his 13 games played last year. And then you talk about the health, right? Like, the knee injury, we'll see if he's over that. He also had a concussion and a collarbone injury. But the large problem comes just from he's not on the field as a full-time player. The Buffalo Bills don't throw enough because they're too good of a team. And that just kind of roadblocks a player like him because he's not going to score a lot of touchdowns. And that's kind of the barometer that is set for Dalton Kincaid right now.
Today I learned what a Morel Lavalley lesion is. That's what Kincaid was dealing with reportedly on his right knee. He might have had issues on both knees last year. And, Rich, especially when it's your team, not that this is really objective, but like Gabe Davis had a down year before he left, and it was, he sprained his ankle in week 2. So what could you expect? I don't know, maybe put him on the injury report once, maybe put Kincaid on the injury report. But so you never really know what to do with that. But physically, it doesn't sound great either. Rich Hribar, our guest on the West Her Hotline. Do you have a favorite, either in terms of just production, period, or even through a fantasy lens, based on where they're going, of the Bills' skill position players? Does anybody, maybe starting with Shakir or even Cook, who's not around but probably will be, I want to say, that works for you?
Yeah, and talk about Dalton Kincaid. Just the last point too is that Dawson Knox. This is probably, I would assume, the last year he's on the Bills. We'll see. He's due $17 million next year, and we've already seen some of the moves the Bills had to kind of operate with this offseason with Josh Allen's new contract. Josh Allen is a $36 million cap hit this year, but the remainder of that contract, it goes $50 million plus. And you look at Dawson Knox, he could save them over $10 million next year. So I imagine at least at base value, they're going to ask him to take a pay cut. And then if he doesn't, then we'll see how that plays out. So if you are in a dynasty stance, I still think there's a lot of runway for Dalton Kincaid. It's just the way the Bills kind of operate right now and kind of the way their team is looking on paper. Obviously James Cook is the one skill player that gets the most, garners the most attention from the Bills. If you look at his first 3 years, it's almost a direct dead overlap to what Aaron Jones did in Green Bay. He's a very Aaron Jones type player. He may never get 300 touches, but he is a very explosive player. He can be an efficient player without getting that immense high workload to contribute the pass game, the run game. I will say my favorite player to kind of at cost is still Keon Coleman, and for a couple of reasons. One, year 2 wide receivers have always been kind of a fantasy football hack. If you're looking for guys that beat ADP, there's been no tried and true value spots in year 2 wide receivers, especially guys that aren't costly or maybe disappointed a little bit like Keon Coleman did in the counting stat department. But there are a lot of positives, I think, at his cost where to get as a wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6. Well, one, he averaged almost 20 yards per catch, 19.2 yards per catch. That was 7th among wide receivers. In these wide receiver 1 and 2 sets that we talked about that Shakir's on the field, this is where Keon Coleman thrived. That's where he averaged those 19 yards per catch. And despite missing 4 games, he was the guy. He led the team with 8 end zone targets. And before he had that wrist injury in week 9, we saw him to get a little bit of steam. He had the 4 for 125 game against the Titans. That was the game right after they got, Amari Cooper. Then in Seattle, he had the 5 for 70 and 1, then hurts his wrist and doesn't come back until week 15. Then he's kind of lost in the sauce the remainder of the season. So anytime I can get, kind of a big body guy that could potentially score double-digit touchdowns, which is what he can. Is he going to catch 75 passes? Absolutely not. But at a guy in the wide receiver 50 to 60 range that could potentially catch 8 to 10 plus touchdowns, that's a guy I'm just going to throw, and let the fantasy gods take the wheel, especially attached to the number 1 quarterback in ADP.
Well, I know we are in the best shape of his life season here, but Coleman got, much like Kincaid, sort of laid out by the coach and GM when the season ended. Work hard, learn to be a pro, all that sort of stuff. Get stronger, come back from injury. And the reviews so far here early this spring, Rich, are very positive. I even heard the show before ours talking about how the coordinator's talking about him being more dialed in. I shouldn't say more dialed in, but asking good questions in meetings about the playbook. And so maybe that year 2 breakthrough to some extent is heating up for Coleman.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I mean, you just want to chase these guys that are cheap and have kind of that touchdown upside. And then your two wide receivers, again, tried and true. The little fantasy hack for everyone listening.
What are you doing at tight end? Or how, if you're not drafting a lot, like how are you looking at that position? It's always a big topic. The elite tight ends. Bowers is almost in the first round. McBride is in the second round at underdog for one. Do you find yourself feeling like that's a good investment, or would you rather wait? I think you can do almost anything myself. I mean, the names at the bottom are kind of interesting sometimes, or in the middle, but I mean, Bowers and McBride are a cut above.
Yeah, and I would include George Kittle, who led the tight ends in fantasy points per game last year. I think the gap from him and the other two is still a little too wide, especially with the 49ers and kind of this transition period. I think the 49ers have signaled they want to be more of a traditional drop-back team than they've been in recent years. I mean, you get rid of Deebo Samuel via trade, a guy that sucked up a lot of targets that were almost manufactured touches in a sense, a lot of touches near the line of scrimmage and behind the line of scrimmage. Also, remember when the season opened, they released Kyle Juszczyk. And granted, that was part of saving money, but they were willing to say, we don't know if we're going to get him back. And I do think they're going to play a lot more 11 personnel and play a lot more three wide receiver stuff, especially when Brandon Ayuk gets up to speed. Mm-hmm. But George Kittle is still a guy that you just look at his production year in and year out, and from an efficiency stance, he's just so good. He just does things that other tight ends can't do. And from a spike week stance, if you're especially in these best balls, there's no player since he's entered the NFL that operates from a spike week stance like he does. It's always the volatility of him because he's on a team that doesn't throw a lot of passes that people get frustrated with. But from you're in these best ball leagues, his ceiling's just as high as McBride and Bowers, and I think the gap is exploitable there. And then after Kittle's off the board, if I don't get him and I'm not a spot to get him, then I'm just largely waiting and throwing darts at the position. I do like Dallas Goedert. I think that this is a team, the Philadelphia Eagles are a team that are going to have to throw more this year. I mean, they led by, or they trailed in the fourth quarter of games 62 snaps last year.
Wow.
It's just this team's going to be pressed more to have to throw more passes this season. Jalen Hurts only averaged 11 dropbacks in the second half of games last year. Just by default, that's going to go up. So you look at Dallas Goedert's a guy I'm kind of signaling, TJ Hawkinson coming back kind of where he's at. And then just kind of waiting. Hunter Henry is probably my favorite value guy. Mm-hmm. All of his peripherals stand out from a usage stance. Everyone is on Drake May too. I don't know if I could say that around these parts. People listening.
It's cool. You're fine. You're fine.
But everyone is on Drake May, and the arrow pointing up for him from a fantasy stance. But Hunter Henry's going tight end 20 still, and this is a guy that's going to not come off the field. He's going to be involved in the red zone. He was another guy when you look at when he was getting targeted on the field was in the top 10 at tight ends. And so if we're pointing the arrow up for Drake May, I'm just going to say, hey, it's a cheap stacking partner for him with Hunter Henry.
Absolutely. I feel like when I draft May, I kind of need Henry because I don't, right in that same range is where it's Kyle Williams or Diggs before that. And if you're not on them, then it's either Henry or one of these 7 other tight ends they're dragging around. Very good, Rich. Well, I'm glad we could have you on. I'm guessing you don't do a lot of these hits for as many times as I see you, where you're actually literally just talking on your phone and not on a stream.
No, not very often. I will say, not to pander to my audience, I've been fortunate to be able to do this for over a decade and been exposed to all the fan bases. And I've always thought the Bills fan base was my favorite and the best to interact with. So you guys have had that feather in your cap for a while for my book.
And I think they, or we, if I may, will definitely keep you honest. If we don't if we don't agree, this fan base will tell you, Rich. So you might, if you like that, that's probably healthy. That's probably good. I have a close friend who's a huge fan of yours, and I know he's listening today. So really excited we could have you on.
Absolutely, I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Until we meet again, whether that's at a craps table, at a conference, or some other stream, all the best to you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Rich. Rich Hribar at Lord Reebs, Reebs, on, what do you call X?
Sure. That's, yeah. I've never referred to it as that, but fine. Yeah.
You're going to have to start.
Yeah, I guess.